Ex Libris event with André Lecours to present his new book, Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy, edited by Oxford University Press this very same year, 2021. And it's therefore a pleasure to have you all with us here today in this webinar hosted by the Institute for Comparative Federalism of Eurac Research here at Bolzano Bozen. And I will briefly outline the program that we will have today, and we will shortly start the discussion. First of all, my name is Francesco Javier Romero. I will moderate this event. And first, we will start with some opening remarks by the Honorable Stéphane Dion, Canadian Ambassador to Germany and Special Envoy to the European Union and Europe. Then we will continue with the author of the book, André Lecours, Professor of the School of Political Science at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And after his presentation, we will have two discussants, Sean Müller from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and Elisabeth Alber from the Institute for Comparative Federalism here at Eurac Research. We will conclude after having, of course, the Q&A, and the speakers can also freely engage with each other. We will conclude with some concluding remarks by Francesco Palermo, professor of the University of Verona, and also head of the Institute for Comparative Federalism at Eurac Research. Before starting, I would like to remind everyone the rules of the game. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to do his presentation, and after all the interventions, we will open a Q&A. For that, you can use the Q&A tab in Zoom that you will find below. And also the speakers are free to engage with each other in the discussion. So we will talk today about the dynamic autonomy and following André's new book that I will remind you again the title, Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy. You can find it also in our program. And without any delays, I will give the floor to Stéphane Dion, Ambassador of Canada to Germany and Special Envoy to the European Union and Europe. Stéphane, the floor is yours. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Oh, thank you very much, Francesco. Grazie mille to you and to Professor Palermo to give me an opportunity to be part of this panel, where indeed we will discuss the book of Professor André Lecours, Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy. The second time I have the honor to be part of a discussion on the book that has been launched a couple of weeks ago. I recommend the book. I think it's a very interesting one. Professor Lecours will be better than me to describe the content, but since I'm invited to give these introductory remarks, I will do it my own way. It's a book about comparative study on different separatist movements in Catalonia, Scotland, Flanders, and South Tyrol, and with also an insight on the Basque Country, Puerto Rico, and Québec. So it's really unlikely that one of us is an expert of all these parts of the world. So you will certainly learn something when you will read the book about one or two or three of these areas. Also, the book is not only a descriptive book. You have a thesis, a central point that is explained by the author through the book. And the central point is that in order to try to foresee if a nationalist movement will become secessionist, the most important point we need to look at is the kind of autonomy that this region that is considering secession is provided with. And if it is a dynamic autonomy, then the likelihood that the nationalist movement will become secessionist is much lower than if there is no dynamic autonomy. So dynamic autonomy is the key concept of the book. So Professor Lecours will describe what he sees by dynamic autonomy, But when you read the book, you come with your own understanding. So I will give to you my own understanding. Dynamic autonomy is ever more autonomy, because nowhere in the book, there is one case where we describe dynamic autonomy as less autonomy. You give autonomy to a region, and oh no, you take it back. That's not dynamic autonomy. That is in fact a recipe for nationalist fever that may create a secessionist fever. When an autonomy has been back, what is given is given. If you bring it out of the region after and you re-centralize, you may be in a situation of a backlash. It's what happened in Quebec when there was an agreement to give to the province of Quebec an autonomous status that was the Meech Lake Accord. And when the rest of the country changed their mind and said, no, you will not have Meech Lake. Well, at this very moment, Quebec had a very, very big nationalist fever that went up to a referendum where the no side and the yes side were almost tied. And the same happened in Catalonia when a status of autonomy has been given, the Estados de las Autonomía. And then the court said, no, it's partly of it is not constitutional. And it created the nationalist fever in Catalonia that is still very high today, as you know. So concretely speaking, dynamic autonomy cannot mean something else than more autonomy. And if you think about a give and take, kind of lateral autonomy, does not work. Nationalists, they don't want to give. Once you give them something, don't bring it back. So he is explaining that in order to prevent a nationalist group to become secessionist, give them always more autonomy. My answer to that, because I must say that I have been responsible for the unity of my country as unity minister during some years, is that don't do that. Take care of autonomy. Professor Lecours is right to focus on autonomy, but don't do only that. You cannot keep a country united in providing ever more autonomy to the region that is considering seceding. That's not the right point. You need, yes, to be respectful of their autonomy and to say what you may give, that makes sense, but also you need to develop a sense of belonging, of working together, shoulder to shoulder, make sure that the people of the regions are well introduced, well integrated in the common institutions of the country, make sure that the identity of this region is compatible and perceived as a great complementarity with the identity of the country, and fight the myths. Be ready to have a very tough debate with the secessionists, respectful but tough, respectful from my side at least, but tough, because when I became the unity minister of my country, the myths against Canada were very entrenched in Quebec culture. That Canada was a centralized country, not a decentralized federation, that Quebec will become English if we stay in Canada, that Quebec does not have its fair share of the federal funding, that Canada is dysfunctional and will become in bankruptcy, and also that the separation may be done unilaterally by the Premier of Quebec, who will have said that I'm the president of a republic after a referendum, and in a legal way, and it will not be so complicated to do. So all these myths, we needed to dismiss them. The other thing is, if you want to look at the book not as a prescriptive book, but as a book that gives you an explanatory aspect, it will explain to you how nationalist movement may become secessionist movement. It's not enough to look at the amount of autonomy or the dynamic autonomy. There are other aspects we need to consider very carefully. I will mention 4 before my 10 minutes are over. One aspect is the geostrategic aspect, the demographic aspect. A secession is almost always a group in a country that is in a minority in the country, but if they were creating international borders around their region, they would become a majority in their country. So the Francophones in Quebec are a minority in Canada, would become a majority if Quebec was independent. So they want to become a majority. So you need to look at which percentage they represent in the region in question. If you look at the case of Flanders, the first thing you need to keep in mind is that Brussels, the Flemish people, they want to keep Brussels. To separate without Brussels is not something a lot of them would consider. But Brussels is 96% not Flemish. So that's the difficulty they have to make sure that separation may be an option. Imagine if Montreal was 96% non-Francophone, or Glasgow 96% non-Scottish, or Barcelona 96% non-Catalan. The separation of Catalonia, Scotland, and Quebec would be much more complicated to imagine. So that's the first thing you need to look at in order to predict if a movement will become secessionist. The second one is the legal feasibility. Most democracies have ruled out secession. It's not part of the public domain. In Italy, Article 5, Section 5 of the Constitution of Italy said Italy is, the Republic is one and indivisible. You have the same in Spain, the same in France, the same in the United States. So almost all democracies, they say that. They consider that the citizenship, when you are a citizen of a country, you cannot lose your citizenship unless there is a law that said you have lost your citizenship for very grave behavior. So that's the second point. In Canada, secession is possible through a process, not unilateral secession, but negotiated secession. But in other countries, it's not. And this is a situation that may convince a nationalist group to look at something else than secession. The legal feasibility. Another point we need to consider is the economic cost of secession. If you look at the case of Puerto Rico, they have a legal possibility to become an independent country. The United States is not against that, but they don't, because they are richer than all the Latin American countries. So they consider that their openness to the US resources is something they want to keep. So economic cost is also something that may explain why a nationalist movement is not secessionist. And finally, the fourth point is, I go back to asymmetry, to autonomy. Autonomy is not only dynamic autonomy that you need to look at when you look at if a nationalist movement will become secessionist. It's also the asymmetry of the autonomy, because sometimes nationalists, they want to have something of their own. They want to say, you see, I'm something else than these administrative regions that we have in the rest of the country. I have my own status. And so if you have part of an asymmetry that is strong in the country, it may be sufficient to convince a lot of people that are nationalists to not become secessionists. I think if you look at the Basque countries in Spain today, they have been very, very secessionist in the past. For now, they are quiet regarding the aspiration of secession. I think there are two reasons. The first reason, they have seen how much secession is difficult to do since Catalonia failed. But second, Catalonia is asking to have the status of the Basque Country. The nationalists in Catalonia said, we would like to have the fiscal status of the Basque Country. And so, and Madrid said no. So the Basque nationalists in the Basque Country, they feel very proud of their status. They consider it as something that is very valid, and since other regions would like to have it, they don't have it. So in a nutshell, it's a very interesting book. The central thesis is very interesting because it's an occasion to have very good debates. To me, it's part of reality, but if you do only that, to give more autonomy to a region, it's a recipe to feed separatism, not to fight it, first point. And second, to explain why a nationalist movement does not become secessionist, it's only one aspect you need to look at, and very often it will not be the main one. So thank you very much. I think we'll have a very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your opening remarks. And now we will give the floor to André Lecours, to the author of the book, that I'm sure we will enlighten us with more insight about the book.
All right. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Stefan, for your comments. Thanks to everybody for being here, and to everybody at Eurac for having organized this event. And I'll come back to it in a few minutes, but my stay at Eurac in 2017 was really really crucial, really, in giving some direction to this book, as you can already see by the concepts that have been discussed, but I'll get back to that in a minute. As kind of Stefan indicated, the book is really tackling one question, and it's why are some nationalist movements strongly secessionist, right? In other words, why is it that the predominant objective of some movement is outright independence, as opposed to simply increased autonomy within the state? So that's really the question. The book is not about the origins of nationalism. It's not about secession, really. It's about secessionism and what makes secessionism strong in advanced industrialized liberal democracies, because those are really the only cases that I look at in some depth. So of course, it's not a prescriptive book. It's not a book that's looking to tell practitioners or policymakers what to do. It looks to solve a puzzle, essentially, and I'll get back to that also very shortly. Now, I guess my own ontological view is that nationalist movements in these multinational democracies are here to stay, that multinational democracies are here to stay, that they're perennial for political and institutional reasons, not for kind of essentialist kind of reasons, but I take that as a given. The normative basis, I guess, for my research is my interest in the question of how to preserve multinational democracies, right? How to preserve them and how to keep them relatively free of at least really severe conflict. So empirically, it's really the cases of Catalonia and Scotland that got me going on this research, because the secessionist turn in Catalonia, the referendum on Scottish independence, all of these things were really not foreseen or predicted by the literature, even as late as the kind of early to mid 2000s, right? I mean, certainly in the 90s and the early 2000s, the discourse in the literature was very much that, certainly in Europe, European integration and broader globalization had rendered these secessionist projects kind of passé, because why would you want to have borders, right? Seems a bit strange today, but that's kind of that was kind of what was found in the literature about 20 years ago. So the notion that states had already accommodated their nationalist movements, or the nationalist movements inside, within that, globalization and European integration were rendering kind of outright traditional old-fashioned independence, if you will, somewhat moot. That was kind of the dominant argument in the literature. So then that became a puzzle, what happened in Scotland and what happened in Catalonia. And only adding to the puzzle was the fact that there were some other minority national communities where secessionism did not strengthen, right? That was certainly the case in Flanders, and of course also the case in South Tyrol. And here again, I want to say a few words about my stay at Eurac in 2017. There's something interesting about the process of discovery, that you can't always plan for everything. And when I went to Bolzano, I knew I wanted to find out about the case, but I didn't quite know yet how I was going to use it. And but it struck me right away that I thought there was theoretical significance there to South Tyrol, because of the weakening of secessionism in time. And I saw, in one of Elisabeth's article, this kind of expression of South Tyrol being on a path from external to internal self-determination. I had read Grotti's book before, From National Rage to Regional State. So I started wondering, like, what caused that, And then I kind of stumbled upon this, what was, a political slogan, because I remember Elisabeth telling me, dynamic autonomy, that's a political slogan, right? And I thought, okay, but maybe that has kind of conceptual and theoretical value. And then, discussing with a lot of people at Eurac, including Francesco, of course, about the commissions and the governance of the autonomy by the commissions, I started thinking about how, South Tyrol's autonomy being constantly on the move, right? And not always increased, but I would say laterally adjusted, was part of I think the answer for why secessionism had weakened there, a big part of it, and maybe part of a more general answer. And in some way I started making a link with another case that I knew well, which was Flanders. Although a lot of things are quite different, of course, between the two, I felt that also in the case of Flanders, autonomy had been dynamic, although in a very different way. So I kind of took that and ran with it. So to understand what leads to strong secessionism, I conducted a controlled comparison in the book of, on the one hand, Catalonia and Scotland, where secessionism strengthened in the early 2000s. And on the other hand, Flanders and South Tyrol, where secessionism remained weak. So the design here is such that I'm looking for something that Flanders and South Tyrol shares, something that they share, but which is not found in Catalonia and Scotland during my time period. So again, this design is such that I control for a lot of variables. I can eliminate a lot of several potential explanations, like the European Union and all of its crises, the wave of populism, and perhaps more crucially, the degree of autonomy. If you look at these four, we'll call them regions here for the purpose of measuring autonomy. If you look at these four regions, they have about the same level of autonomy. Certainly, if you look at the RAI, the Regional Autonomy Index, you see that they're quoted at having basically the same autonomy, and that kind of, to me, was important because a lot of authors in the literature, if only implicitly, attempted to explain secessionism through, how much autonomy do regions have, right? Do they have enough? Do they not have enough? Should they have more? And so on and so forth. So what I found in conducting this controlled comparison was a few things. First, that it's not the degree of autonomy that really matters, nor is it the design, right? Because you can be a formal federation, like Belgium, you can have an autonomy statute like Italy and South Tyrol, you can have devolution in Scotland, and so on and so forth. You don't find really common threads here. So it's not really about the degree or the design of autonomy, but maybe I thought it's about the nature of autonomy, and more specifically how autonomy evolves or not in time. So I wanted to bring in this temporal element, which of course theoretically I'm sympathetic to, but I thought here that it mattered quite a lot. So I made this conceptual distinction between static and dynamic autonomy. And I define in the book dynamic autonomy as being a type of autonomy that is either adjusted laterally or progressively expanded in time, and static autonomy as a type of autonomy that is final and an unchangeable settlement. So to me, that led me to formulate basically what is the theory of secessionism that I put forward in the book, which is that static autonomy stimulates secessionism while dynamic autonomy staves it off. So the explanation here, the logic of the theory is that static autonomy basically places members of a minority national community before only two self-determination options, independence and the status quo. So as such, it generates incentives for supporting secessionism. Dynamic autonomy, on the other hand, involves self-determination options other than simply independence and the status quo, in the form of increased or adjusted autonomy. So as a result, dynamic autonomy reduces incentives for supporting secession. So to put it in historical institutionalist terms, my kind of theoretical framework, autonomy that doesn't adapt to the evolving processes of nationalism. Because nationalism is composed of processes of identity formation, transformation, the same thing for interests, right? The interests of a minority national community are not given, they're constructed, they're defined, but these things change in time, right? And if autonomy doesn't adjust to these, then there's friction. There's friction between the institutional order of autonomy on the one hand, and the political and social order of the minority national community on the other hand. And this friction comes out in the form of secessionism. That's kind of my historical institutionalist view on that. So I'll finish by saying that one of the things that, as I was presenting this work in various conferences, one of the things that was often said to me, and something I haven't completely resolved in the book, and that I think that's where I go, that's where my next steps take me, is that, you know, is it objective, the objective nature of autonomy that's important, or is it how it's framed, essentially, right? Is it how citizens perceive autonomy, and linked to that, how political actors frame it, right? Because you could see how political actors, some political actors will want to frame autonomy as being static, as being a dead end, as being closed, whereas others will want to frame it as being open-ended, as being potentially in movement, and so on and so forth, right? So that would take me more into kind of constructivist approaches to nationalism as opposed to strictly institutionalist approaches or political institutionalist approaches. So I think that's something, again, that I haven't completely resolved in the book, but I tease out a little bit through the case of Puerto Rico how I think that that's important, because Puerto Rico objectively has not had dynamic autonomy. It hasn't changed, but there's certainly the view that it can be changed, that there's lots of options for Puerto Ricans in between the status quo and independence, including, of course, statehood in the American Federation. So there is this view, as framed by virtually all of the political actors in Puerto Rico, that this is indeed possible, that it's only up to for Puerto Ricans to make a choice, and they can make a choice whenever they want. I don't think that that's really the case, but that's kind of the way the discourse has been framed. So I'll stop here and await for further comments, and maybe I'll just wait until these comments by Sean and Elisabeth are made to respond as well to Stéphane Dion's opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, André, for your presentation. I'm sure there will be comments by everyone. So now we will move to our first discussant, to Sean Müller from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and thank you, André, for having written the book and having allowed me to read it, and Francesco for organizing the talk. So I'll try to be, as Stefan said, respectful but tough in my comments. I have a couple of comments on the concept theory, and then a few minor comments on the method and the data side. Okay, 10 minutes, so 1 minute per comment. Overall, it's a great book because it's new and innovative. So there is really something to be learned, even for people that have worked on federalism, nationalism, secessionism for ages. Not to say that I have been working on that for ages, but I think there is something new there that you're getting at that brings us forward, moves us forward. In the beginning, I found the jump from the new institutionalism to the state to the autonomy a bit too quick. So it's just imperceptibly over 2 lines, you say, well, the state is important, so therefore it has to be autonomy. And similarly on page 31, when you say, as you also did just now, it cannot be populism or the Euro crisis because these are all European countries. So it has to be autonomy. That has to be the key difference. Maybe that is also due to the fact that the theory chapter is sort of divided between chapter 2 and 8. So you start the theory and then come the cases and then you finish the theory, but yet you say it's towards a theory. So even there, you don't really finish the theory. I think you could have been a bit more upfront. Here's the theory and here's my test, but maybe that's just my quantitative mindset that I'm using. I'm used to having these hypotheses and then the test. Dynamic autonomy, which is really the core concept. I think it remains still a bit fuzzy. So it's two endpoints on a continuum, and then it's constitutional, but it's also intergovernmental relations, and then it's also opt-outs in the case of Canada, but then it's also the referendums with different options on the ballot that allows people to have the perception that the autonomy is potentially moving if only they wished so. As you just said in the talk also, if the concept is so crucial, I think you could develop it further and really try to measure it or scale it in a way that it becomes a bit more tangible. I also think it's a bit overstated to say that it's just the nature of the autonomy and not also the extent and the areas. I mean, of course, regions where a language other than the majority language is spoken, of course, autonomy in the language area, culture education is important, and not as much as in the transport area, or the other way around for peripheral regions that speak the same language, but are otherwise peripheral and economically behind. So it's not, surely it cannot just be the nature of the autonomy. It also at least has to be which policy area and how much autonomy, especially fiscal autonomy, they have. I think you became a bit the victim of your own quest to find an elegant, a couple of times you say you want an elegant, you want a simple and elegant, and there's beauty in that. And I agree, we should have, or ideally we have an elegant explanation for complex phenomena. That's the purpose of the theory. But if the explanation is complex, forcing it into a binary or a continuum, we risk losing some of the information that is also there. I'll get to that. As you also just said, maybe more a follow-up question, what drives the evolution of these demands, the nationalist demands? Is it really objective fact? So the rise of the service economy in some areas that calls for new powers to be devolved or acquired, and if it's not given, then there is conflict? Or is it just a construction by the elite that really have nothing else to do than call for more autonomy, even though objectively they would not necessarily needed? Or is it a bit of both? Is it objective changes of the socio-cultural, socio-economic environment, plus the elite that seeks for further demands, further justifications, also of their own being, right? I mean, these parties, once they exist, they also need to justify their existence and members and show that they do something, or at least that they try to do something, the claims. Because on the other hand, if the demands don't change, then static autonomy would suffice, right? Then that would be fine too. But you presuppose that the demands always change, maybe because you come from the side of nationalism and there is an inherent dynamic in nationalism that there is always something to be demanded for. In a way, in the Belgian case, the paradox is this. So in a way, it has worked well. There were demands, autonomy was expanded. There were further demands, autonomy was expanded. But it has worked so well that it does not seem to work anymore because it's just an ongoing process. And if you give something in the 6th reform, then you know that there will be a 7th reform and further things will be given. So does not that also downplay the previous steps of having given in to the demands? You see what I mean? So the dynamism itself makes these whole concessions, as I would call them, less valuable than they would seem if it was a one-off or a two-off. Another point that struck me a bit, and that's, I think, one of the main quarrels I would have, is it really the output, the dynamic autonomy, that is the hero, or is it not much more the process, the negotiations, the access, the parity, the commission of 6, you mentioned 3 and 3, plus in the case of South Tyrol, plus also a linguistic parity, or even, or at least from the Italian-German side, not an over-representation of the Italian speakers. Of course, it's both, and you're honest enough and intellectually smart enough to say it's not just the output, it's also the process. And I'm just wondering whether it's not much more the process than the output. I don't know, it's an open question that I have because I work on shared rule, and shared rule is all about access, but access not only in view of getting more for oneself, for one's own region, but also in trying to influence the rules for the whole state. So upgrading, upscaling one's own and policy ideas. So for instance, the dual education system in South Tyrol, practiced as in the other Germanic speaking countries, is kind of an upgrade attempt to impose, not to impose, but to export a regional solution to the whole state. Would that not respond even more to this nationalist interest and identity? The one thing is to be taken on board. Okay, you want that, I give it to you. And the other is, oh, you want that, but you know what? Let's actually give that to everybody because it's such a great idea. Would that not counter this nationalist drive towards secessionism even more. And then finally, on the method and case, I think that the research design is great. It's really elegant to have these two cases, especially since you have two least likely cases of secessionism, historically, Catalonia and Scotland, and two most likely cases of secessionism, Flanders and South Tyrol. And we have the opposite explanation, opposite outcomes in all four. So that's really a nice, I mean, congrats on just having come up with that research design on its own. However, I would have liked a summary table or a graph. It must have been the first book in a long while that where there was not a single table or a graph that summarizes, the four cases, and that's the common factors, and that's the differences, and that explains. I mean, that's a typical case for this kind of research design, to have just a table with 4 columns. It would have helped also to highlight other differences and similarities that crop up here and there. So the size or the economic wealth or the proportion of people that speak a different language. You mentioned also survey attitudes here and there, and they're a bit scattered over the different footnotes. I mean, who the hell trusts surveys anyway, right? So it's good you bury them in the footnotes, but in a way you could have made them also a more prominent element of the research design basis. And then finally, you not only have those 4 cases, and I'll conclude on that point, but then you also look at additional cases, Basque Country, Québec, and Puerto Rico, which I found really nice, because in a way you apply what you have found to other cases, and you're honest enough to consider other factors, such as the history of political violence, such as an internal federal structure in the Basque Country, or consultative referendums that create this perception of, yes, the autonomy would be an evolving thing if only we wanted. But how and why are those 3 chosen? It's a bit less clear. They fall from the sky. The rationale for choosing the 4 main ones is very clear and very convincing. And then those 3, they come from nowhere. And more generally, what is the universe of cases or the other cases that your theory should speak to? I mean, Corsica, Bretagne, they're mentioned. What about Alsace? What about Bavaria? Or Wales and Northern Ireland, where you also have the irredentist streak as you have in South Tyrol? That would have also been a nice comparison. Or German-speaking Belgians. You mentioned at some point the duality of Belgium. Well, poor German speakers in Belgium, they're never included. And yet they're not secessionist, as far as I know, because they piggybacked on the autonomy, resulting as being dynamic from the main 2 conflicting regions. Or Ticino and Canton of Jura. As a Swiss, I'm always obliged to make this comment. You don't have to be multinational to become or to remain multicultural. It's enough to have a system, constitutional democracy, maybe, or more shared rule, maybe, that allows the different regional communities to continue being different and yet belong to an overarching unity such as a federation. I'll conclude on that. I think it's exactly 10 minutes. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you very much, Sean. You gave us what you promised. We're respectful but tough. And now we will move to our next panelist, to our colleague Elisabeth Alber from the Institute for Comparative Federalism here at Eurac Research. So Elisabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And yeah, congrats to the book, André. First of all, I have very fond memories, actually, when we were sitting on the Walter Square, actually, and discussing on the political concept of dynamic autonomy, which in the case of South Tyrol, obviously, is also pretty much, it depends who's speaking, calls it dynamic autonomy, calls it full autonomy, calls it with whatever adjective you can think of. I could now basically speak a bit on South Tyrol, but I would not, I prefer not to do that. And I will also not repeat some of the comments Sean actually did. I had similar in my mind. I just wanted to make one general comment and then actually zoom a bit out also of the book, as you refer also to the idea of kind of testing this conceptual innovation, this theory, this continuum also on cases beyond, let's say, the Western European sphere. So the general comment is also on this, the fact that you say, okay, it's not so important to look at the degree or the design, but it's more the nature. Obviously here, it really depends how we define the 3 terms. But the nature is very often actually heavily influenced by the design in the end, because then it is about the process and it is about the negotiations. And this is the general comment also Sean made, I would basically say. And just a bit to challenge ourselves in this panel, and with regard also to the broader topic of your book, and because it is really, really, really timely, I would like to spend a few minutes on a very tricky question when it comes to autonomy, self-determination, and let's say nationalist indigenous movements. Because in exactly 3 days' time, there is the third and last referendum of independence in New Caledonia. And this actually is really a tricky case because it is super multidimensional, and you refer in your book very often to the fact that autonomy is a multidimensional issue. It made me reflect that the case of New Caledonia can be viewed either as dynamic or as static autonomy. It really depends from which angle you look at it, because basically just 2 sentences for those who might not know the case. New Caledonia is an island, basically 2,000 kilometers east of Sydney. It has more or less, a bit less than 300,000 inhabitants. And out of those, 40% are belonging to the indigenous group, autochthonous populations called Kanak. And about 25% are so-called Europeans or descendants. And the rest is from the area of the Pacific Islands all over in the Pacific. So that's a bit the demography. And this case, as I said, is really tricky to somehow put it into your theory. And when I was reading the book, I was triggered actually to think of that case, because if you take it from an international law perspective, that case, so if you think about the influence of geoeconomics, geopolitics, and so on autonomy and on secessionisms, then you might say, okay, international law, strictly speaking, says that self-determination, independence of referendums, even in the case of decolonialization, is not mandatory. French law instead made it mandatory. So it's the French constitution actually saying that New Caledonia has a special status, and it is outlining a section where it says that it is a transitional special status. So having the third and last referendum on the 12th of December actually means that it could be the end of negotiations. It could be the end of, if we consider it up to now, dynamic autonomy. Because if we look at the constitutional law, we could also say it is a static autonomy, the case of New Caledonia, because it is, I mean, the French parliament at a certain stage passed a law, and so there is an autonomy statute which is comparable to that of South Tyrol. It's, in some cases, it even goes further because it has the principle of irreversibility of the transfer of legislative powers in there. So this is a very, very strong principle. So if the third referendum confirms the no to the independence, then actually everything is again on politics, and everything goes back on basically negotiations. New Caledonians are basically asked to vote on uncertainty because they don't really know what comes next. There's a political agreement that next there will be negotiations again, and there will be a fourth referendum, which might be mandatory, which might not be mandatory, on deciding the final stage. And this actually just brings me just to add an additional thought to this binary between static and dynamic autonomy, what we see beyond Europe. And what we have seen also this summer, for example, with regard to the Papua autonomy, where actually also the autonomy was taken away. So I was really wondering how you would then apply. I mean, I know that you also know this, the case of New Caledonia, how you would apply that and how you see that, because it really depends on how you interpret it. If you take it from constitutional law, if you take it from international law, coupled with decolonialization, and if you admire, let's say, the procedural mastery of having 3 referendums in a row after a negotiation process of more than, it's almost 40 years, that there was a negotiation process that actually led to this series of referendum, which also means that the people actually change. It also means, put simply, that the electorate changes. So there is implications, actually. It's the United Nations itself that actually, with regard to New Caledonia, just a few years ago, actually said, like, we are in presence of 5 people. 5 peoples on one island. So the last comment is, who is the people? So who is the people, and how do we deal with, let's say, we can have many surveys, we can trust the surveys, but it boils a bit down to the question, who is the people? And how can we actually then really measure it? Do we necessarily have to go back to qualitative research only, in the sense that we cannot have broad assumptions, or that we necessarily have to go with in-depth interviews to really validate the basic questions? Or how do we deal with this big issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisabeth, for this interesting insight on the case of New Caledonia. And I think now, after we have heard all our panelists, we can you can freely engage with each other. I think André has some points to answer, and also our audience is free to use the Q&A tab for asking questions to all of our panelists. So André, I think I will give you the floor to answer all the questions that are flying in the air.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. I mean, I think there's a commonality there from the comments of my colleagues, which is that, of course, it's more complicated than just the dynamic versus static autonomy, right? That maybe there's part of it that's demography, that's symmetry, that's design of autonomy, that's degree of autonomy. There's a lot of things. And I mean, I don't disagree with that, of course. I mean, who can disagree with the notion that, social sciences, human affairs are complicated and so on and so forth. But I guess there was a bit of an epistemological posture in the book, if you will. And again, that was very much shaped by my stay at Eurac, because if I hadn't been to Eurac then in 2017, maybe I think the book would have looked quite different. It would have been the type of book that says, secessionism is really complicated. There's a lot of factors that contribute to it, and I'll discuss all of those. I was kind of almost going in that direction. But then I decided to, I guess, produce a different type of study, right? Which attempted to draw some kind of general proposition from a controlled comparison of 2 pairs of cases. So different type of social science, but I understand that I might do violence to some things. I guess at the end, my argument remains that, okay, it's probably not just the nature of autonomy, but my argument is that that's the most important factor. And you probably, some of you disagree with that. That's okay. Of course, that's just something I'm putting out there. And again, that's something that comes out of a very specific comparison of these 4 cases, right? So you can, throw all kinds of other cases at me, and okay, I can see how my theory fits with these cases. Maybe it doesn't. My theory really comes from a controlled comparison of these 4 cases. And I understand that it's a kind of a mid-range theory, right? I mean, I'm not venturing very much outside of, liberal democracies, advanced industrialized liberal democracies here, which is why, Elisabeth, I'm not sure I want to comment too much on New Caledonia, because I don't really have the kind of, I don't have very much empirical knowledge on it. And maybe, I mean, again, the relationship with France there is too different in nature from the relationship between the minority national communities and the states that I use in the book, right? So I'm putting forward this general proposition with maybe the modest ambition that it can have some more general theoretical sway, but I won't be too, I guess, certain of that outside of its kind of immediate ambit. I do, and I'm not going commentator by commentator here. I'm just doing some responses on general points that I see as being almost common. On this, I think here I'll speak to Sean a bit more specifically, but I think that came out in the other commentators' views as well. I do think it's a lot about process, and I do think that at the end of the day, what keeps secessionism relatively weak, I don't think it'll be non-existent, right? In most of these communities where there's a nationalist movement, I think there'll always be a little bit of secessionism, but what keeps it weaker is process, and is really the notion that you have communities, or at least their leadership, in discussion and negotiation, right? And I think that, and here to come back on one of Stefan's point on asymmetry, I think, and I do mention that in the book, I think dynamic autonomy also involves some kind of implicit recognition, right? So there's something that's met or that's satisfied when you look at the claims of most nationalist movements, which is, say, some kind of acknowledgement of a nation, if you will, right? I think that's implicitly done by having autonomy up for discussion, right? So I do think that process is important. I mean, I do agree that it's still hard to nail down dynamic autonomy, even at the end of the book, right? And I've been certainly wrestling with that throughout the research. I thought there was something important there, and I didn't want to stop myself from leveraging it because there was some, because the conceptual work was hard, right? So I do think that I do have some more work to do on that. And again, when it comes to cases, even cases that I tackle in the book, I mean, I agree that Belgium is not a fantastic way to manage a country in terms of efficiency, democratic representation, all these things. Of course, I've been working on Belgium for 25 years, and I, it's a bit kind of dispiriting, right, Belgium. But the point here is that, I come back to that simple point, is that, secessionism in Flanders has remained weak, despite the fact that you could expect it to be strong, right? Because of all the political crises that have occurred in Belgium. So that's just objectively what I'm trying to explain. I'm not trying to say that, the Belgian way leads to a great way to organize a state. I'm just pointing out what I think is a causation here, right? And yes, maybe in a way, I do put Belgium and then in a more positive light than a lot of the other authors out there, because I'm saying, well, there's a Belgian way of managing multinationalism that might seem completely weird and strange and destructive. But we haven't seen the type of conflict that has occurred between Catalan secessionists in the Spanish state. So maybe there is some virtue, right, in the Belgian way, that way. On retrospect to these other cases that seem to fall from the sky, Sean, there, I mean, as I explained, maybe buried in a footnote, I don't know that's possible, but that I wanted to look at some other cases where there's a significant nationalist movement and also some kind of history of secessionism. And traveling outside of my cases, could I learn some more things from these additional cases, right? And I didn't want to go into, as you say, multicultural kind of countries, or I wanted to stick to nationalism and to secessionism, and look at what these other cases could tell me. So I think I'll leave it at that for my reactions, and I'd be happy to further engage with the discussants, or answer any questions or react to any comments from the crowd as well, our virtual crowd.
Thank you very much, André. For now, we don't have questions in the chat, but I'm sure we will have. But in that case, I will break the ice. And regarding your concept of dynamic autonomy, is there for you like a maximum of autonomy that can be achieved? In other words, is there a limit to that concept of dynamic autonomy, and a limit to that process of adjusting that in the end it will it will end in secession or through the back door, like disconnecting from the state? And also, is there like how does your theory address the possibility of the subunit that is calling for this concept of dynamic autonomy? You said it's not only about enlarging, but in my view, it's always like demanding greater autonomy. But how does your concept react to the possibility of other subunits also demanding that autonomy, and that secessionist subunits, or to say, rejecting that possibility because they want to have some special asymmetry in that regard?
Well, I think on your first point, I think that I don't think that autonomy or self-rule is a zero-sum game with shared rule, right? And that's something I acknowledge that's absent in the book, because my book is about autonomy. It's not about shared rule. But I fully recognize the importance of shared rule. And of course, to preserve multinational democracies, you need shared rule as much as you need autonomy, for sure. But again, I don't think that this is the result of a zero-sum game. You could have autonomy that's up for negotiation, that's laterally adjusted, that can be increased from time to time, coexist perfectly, in my view, with strong and sturdy shared rule, right? So that you have this combination of living together yet apart, and independence and interdependence, to use the slogans of federalism. So that's on shared rule, and that's a good point. I think that's really important. Now, again, on your second point, Francesco, there's a couple. The first one, again, is that I think dynamic autonomy can move laterally. So I understand that if it's only about expanding, that at some point you end up and you have nothing left. You have nothing left to decentralize, and you're in the de facto kind of. Again, if I come back to the two cases, right, in South Tyrol and in Flanders, which are two dynamic autonomy, I argue, we're not in these situations. Are we going to get into these situations? I'm not sure. I don't think we're anywhere near yet. Now, on this point of what are the other regions going to say? Well, here, though, I do make a bit of an ontological distinction between nationalist, and I don't talk about this in the book, I'm just answering your question here, between nationalist and regionalist movements, right? And I think the the peculiarity of nationalist movements is that they make claims in relation to a nation. And that this nation involves claims of self-determination, which are more than just mechanical claims about kind of how a state should work and so on and so forth, right? So I'm not disputing that there could be kind of this Me Tooism reaction, right, as has happened in Spain, of course, but that I think when there's no or virtually no nationalism in a region that's making claims, I think these can be handled quite a bit differently. So that's what I would answer to that. You're muted.
Thank you very much, André. I will give now the floor to Ambassador Dion and then to Francesco Palermo, who also has a comment. But in the meantime, André, there is a question by our colleague Carl Kosla to you on a similar topic to mine in the Q&A, so you can maybe read it in the meantime, and then I will get back to you and you can answer it. Okay, so Ambassador Dion.
So the topic, if we stick to the topic, is how to explain that the nationalist group will become or not secessionist. The first thing we need to look at is the regional concentration. If you speak about New Caledonia, the first thing you need to say is that the Kanak are not 100% of the population. Come on. The support for secession is massively in the group that is looking for the possibility to become a majority in its country. That's the dynamic we are talking about. And you may have support outside the group. Non-Francophone in Quebec, you will find some of them voting for separation. But the core of the support is among Francophones. And the core of the support is among French Canadians. And it's the situation everywhere, including in New Caledonia. So the first thing you need to look at is the geographical concentration. Another thing you need to look at is the feasibility of secession. Is it feasible? In some situations, it's not. For New Caledonia, it is. The French government has said France is indivisible, but not the colonies. And New Caledonia is a dominion of France. So if they want to secede, they may. There is a process for that. The same for Puerto Rico. But if you look at Italy, I'm not the best expert of South Tyrol, but the very moment that the Allies said South Tyrol is part of Italy after the war, Austria said, we agree with the status of South Tyrol as part of Italy. It has been clarified in 1992. And the Constitutional Court of Italy said, Article 5 means that Venetia cannot have a referendum on secession. So South Tyrol, yes, they will push for autonomy, but to be secessionist in a situation like that becomes very, very, very difficult. So to only focus on the nature of autonomy, to me, is too narrow. You miss a lot of important points that will allow you the possibility to understand if a nationalist movement will become secessionist or not.
If I can just react to Stéphane Dion's comments quickly, I understand your argument, of course, Stéphane, but if we talk about Quebec here for a minute, my point would be, okay, Francophone Quebecers don't and have never all wanted independence. So then let's apply the question just to them then, right? It's not because they're a majority in the province, but a minority in the country that they necessarily all want their own country. So what will explain that, that a small number of Francophone Quebecers would want independence versus a large number, right? So here demography is no longer important, right? And of course, again, the constitutional rules of the country, all of this is important to a degree, I acknowledge. But then I think as social scientists, then we kind of fall into a bit of a trap that then everything is important, right? We have 15 factors. So I guess one of the things I was trying to do is, in a sense, order them by tackling just one, right? And So,
You see, you cannot say in Quebec, support for separation decreased because of dynamic autonomy. You know, it's not what happened. It decreased for many reasons. Demography is part of it, because not only francophones you have a lot of non-francophones, especially in Montreal, more than in 1995, but also francophones, they marry with non-francophones more and more. And when you have a mixed background in a family, support for secession is less likely. So that's part of reality. But the main part, I would say, was the debate. The myths that were existing in 1995 are much less entrenched in the mentality of the population. You have still a strong support for separation in Quebec, but it's not as strong as it was, and partly because Canada is not perceived as a centralized country as it was before, that people are more aware that Quebec received equalization payments, that Quebec is not a half province, but a half not province. It's more perceived than it was. That the feasibility of secession will be much more complicated than what we thought. Take the example of the Aboriginal peoples in the north of Quebec. In the referendum of 1980, in the referendum of 1995, they have requested by referendum to stay in Canada, these populations, these people in the north of Quebec, with clear referendum. But if you read a book on the referendum of Quebec of 1980, of the one of 1995, the authors don't take it seriously. They don't mention it, or if they mention it, it's a distracted footnote. But today it would not be. Today we realize that to transfer a population from a country to another one without asking it at least what they think about it would not be feasible in the democracy. These kind of problems were not perceived in 1995. And the question was so confused, by the way, that's another point. Which question is asked to the people? If you ask the people, do you want to separate but to stay in the country by the back door? You may have the kind of result you had in Quebec in 1995. This is not possible anymore. So I think, yes, to respect the autonomy of Quebec, to see if the province may have more, is part of the thing. But to say it's the main thing, it's misguiding. It's not what is happening in my country. And if you look at Belgium, again, the push for separation in Belgium is very difficult to do because the nationalists of Flanders, they don't want to leave without Brussels. So in the meantime, what they're asking for is more and more autonomy, to the point you have a kind of evaporation of the federal institutions of Belgium. I'm a diplomat, so I will not discuss too much what it means for the internal dynamics of Belgium, just to say that when you propose this kind of dynamic for another country, where an enclave like Brussels does not exist, be very careful of what you're proposing to this country.
Oh, so I just want to be clear. I'm not proposing anything. I really want to be clear about that. I am not proposing anything.
Oh, yeah, yes, but a politician who wants to keep his or her country together will read your book and may think, oh, dynamic autonomy is the thing we need to do because it works in Belgium. You understand that? And if in this country you don't have an enclave of the size of Brussels, the result may be very different of the one you have in Belgium. That's my point.
I just want to react quickly, Stefan, on what you said about our country. I think that, to me, some of the reasons why these beliefs have changed is because the political class has abandoned the route of constitutional reform that led to this view of Canada as this centralized, closed, static federation and country. And, switching from, the focus from the Constitution to just the mechanisms of Canadian federalism, I think has helped certainly change those beliefs and lead Quebecers to view, again, autonomy as not stuck, right? That's kind of what I was trying to extract from my very quick discussion of Quebec in the book, right? The change from the Constitution to essentially the roots of Canadian federalism have removed the impression that Canada is static, a dead end, closed, and so on and so forth. So I did see some parallels with some of my other cases, but Just on Carl's question that I see in the chat, Francesco, if I may, again, the question is about, how much autonomy is enough and so on and so forth. Is there a maximum amount of autonomy, a minimum amount of integration? I really can't quantify these, right? And to me, again, it's more about process than about how much autonomy is there, how much autonomy should be left at the end of the day. And again, I think that, keeping autonomy open, on the move, up for negotiation, doesn't mean an endless process of decentralization. I don't think it does.
Okay, thank you, André. I think we have also a question by Francesco Palermo also in the chat. I don't know if you have seen that. And I think Elisabeth has a very short question, and also Sean. And after that, we will move to the concluding remarks by Francesco Palermo, because we're running a bit out of time.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco. I mean, your book is excellent because actually it traces an evolution, and that's never an easy task to do, and to do it in such a comparative way, actually, with so many details. And you set out, let's say, the functioning of autonomy by basically, having static and dynamic definitions on it. What comes to my mind is actually, do we also need to go a step back and ask ourselves, who kicks autonomy off? I mean, who kicks dynamic autonomy off? Not just the Commission of Six and so on and so forth that are then in place and then bring it forward, but who is actually that kicks the whole issue off, and how much is the very origin linked to the fact that nationalist movements turn out to be secessionisms or not? I mean, there have been in the different cases, and linked with the cases in your book, but also to the very case of South Tyrol, a few very critical moments where actually very few people decided something. Had that decision been different, the whole story is totally different. So does it then come back to political sociology in the end? Very much to like going a step back, actually, from discussing static versus dynamic autonomy? Who kicks actually the concepts off? It's political elites.
Yeah, it is. You're right. I think that that's a really good point. Where does it start? How does it start? And at some point, a decision is made, and I think you're right. There's a fork in the road. There's a critical juncture, as historical institutionalists would say, right? That can lead societies into very different paths. And I think, the inclination of most politicians in a multinational democracy will be towards a more static form of autonomy, right? Because it'll be, okay, we don't want to have to deal with this continuously. We want to solve it once and for all, and then we can stop talking about it. And what comes out of my research is that that's probably the wrong approach, and that the better approach would be to think that, okay, this is a multinational democracy. There's going to be claims for self-determination ongoing. They need to be, if not addressed, at least discussed and negotiated on an ongoing basis, right? As opposed to wanting to settle, quote unquote, settle them once and for all so we can talk about more important questions, which is what we often hear. But my argument is that they're never settled once and for all. That's a big part of my argument. They never are, because things change, right? The interests as defined by the elites of minority nations, these interest definitions will change, right? Even the articulation of the identity will change. And there needs to be some kind of response, or else you get tension. Now, maybe states will want to take that approach and live with these tensions, right? That's certainly a policy option, right? And just to quickly address Francesco's question in the chat about, well, overall, of course, Michael Keating's scholarship has been very influential for me. And yes, I do think that this notion that, again, at the most basic level, that, you know, some form of accommodation and ongoing discussion, right, is the best disincentive for secession. And I think that's kind of some of the things that Michael was suggesting in relation to autonomy and European integration 20 years ago or so. I see Sean as a virtual hand up.
Yeah, just a quick comment. In reply to your discussion with Stefan, I also did not read your book as a prescription of this is what has to be done, but I did read it. If states or regions or elites do that, then this will happen. Now, the irony, of course, is that in the two cases where there was static autonomy, Catalonia and Scotland, where we had an escalation, so to speak, of secessionism with referendum or quasi-referendum, exactly in those two cases, the central governments now have to offer more autonomy to quell this rising tide of secessionism. So Devo Max or the vow that you also mentioned a week or two before the independence referendum, or the current negotiations in Spain between the Spanish government and the Catalan government. I mean, both regions have regional parliaments dominated by secessionist parties. Whether that means that actually a majority of voters will vote in an independence referendum for independence is another question. But there has to be something going on, and the only way that this is going to happen is to give them more autonomy. So that's the sad irony in a way. Insisting on static autonomy means you have to give even more autonomy at the later stage, and you lose the agenda-setting power. And the second comment I wanted to make is, you said the natural inclination is for static autonomy, which is sort of a miscalculation or a short-sightedness on the side of the central government. But I think the parallel or the mirror miscalculation is on the side of nationalists, of autonomists, who insist on autonomy, whereas what they should at least also insist on is access to the central government, shared rule, so to speak, to renegotiate. Because where do you defend that autonomy if not abroad in the central government, especially in evolving states such as Spain, Scotland, also Belgium, also Italy, where power was delegated from the center downwards. So you need to be present at the central table if you want to defend your autonomy at home. And that's the miscalculation I see being made on the side of nationalists that realize now, too late, well, actually, it's there we need to be better able to regulate things at home.
I don't disagree with anything you said, Sean. I think you're right.
I would not have thought you would.
Before moving to the concluding comments, can you, André, answer a very short question that we have? I don't know if you have seen it. It inquires about the role of national political parties with opposing ideologies to deal with autonomy demands.
Well, again, states are not monolithic, right? And it's obviously, there's a political debate about how to react to self-determination claims, right? So I think that introduces another element of complexity in the equation, right? Because you can have some national political parties that will be very resistant to any kind of dynamic autonomy, to any kind of ongoing conversation, negotiation, and adjustment to an autonomy status or statute. Whereas you can have other parties that will be a little bit more sympathetic to the idea. So again, politics plays out, and then at the end of the day, you have kind of a predominant approach over a given period of time, right? But of course, you can have, as governments change, states that are more or less conducive to treating autonomy as dynamic. So I think that's a really good point. And again, that's another element of complexity, right? I mean, doing social science in a sense almost always involves some elements of reification, right? And especially in the field of nationalism, of course, right? Because we'll talk about Quebec, Catalonia, Spain, the UK, but you know, we have to fully recognize, of course, that all of these are internally divided, but at different points in time, you have different kind of predominant perspectives that are put in practice, right? But of course, that changes in time depending on how the politics play out.
Francesco?
Yes, so hi, is it me? I see Ambassador Dion has his hand raised. No, it's not.
Well, okay, I just want to add very shortly the two cases that Sean mentioned, Catalonia and Scotland. I would dispute the fact that the secessionist movement is strong in these two countries because the country did not make enough devolution. If you look at Spain, it was a very centralized country, and over a couple of decades, they became one of the most decentralized countries in Europe. The same for Scotland. They did not have any parliament, and now they have a lot of autonomy. And the idea that, oh, people become secessionists because it happened that the central government had to say no to a request. But it's part of life. You can't have everything. The thing we need to keep in mind is that the secessionists, they want a country. They don't want a piecemeal devolution. So what you will give to them will feed them to ask for more, because it's not that they are not immoral. It's because their goal, their dream is to have a country, to have a seat at the United Nations. So that's the dynamic of dynamic autonomy. It's a lot, not only, but a lot coming from the secessionist push itself. So that's the first thing. If you look at Catalonia, the nationalist fever, as I said, did not come for dynamic autonomy, but from the fact that the autonomy has been withdrawn. And then you had a nationalist backlash. And in the case of Scotland, and I conclude with that, the big mistake I think the government of the UK made is to think that to allow an autonomy, and even a dynamic autonomy, will be enough. They did not try to explain in which way Scotland is stronger in the UK. Scots are incredible good British people. They help the world fantastically. We need to stay together. All these kind of points have not been done enough. And it's not me who's saying that. It's Tony Blair himself. I quote Tony Blair in his biography. Where I think we were wrong was in believing that devolution would end the argument of independence. I do think one of the weaknesses in the way we approach devolution was not to build real cultural ties and emphasize the enormous things that the different countries in the United Kingdom have in common. Well said.
All right, now I suppose I have to make some concluding statement, right? Okay. Well, thank you all first. It was a great debate, very inspiring. And I guess the conclusion is, André, like for every successful book, you are expected to write another one, or at least a second edition. Because there are many, many points that the book is raising, and perhaps deserve further attention on that. Well, very briefly, on the one hand, I believe this is a great book, indeed. And the main aspect is that despite the last comment by Ambassador Dion, which is also, thought-provoking in a way, I believe the underlying thesis is convincing. So, in fact, it's like children, right? Apparently, sometimes if you treat them sharply and harshly, then you might get something back in a short term. right? They obey, they go to school, they do their homework, they do what the parents expect them to do. But treating people not nicely in the long run is probably not a good idea, and at some point then the problem re-emerges. So I think it is convincing, this idea of the ongoing and never-ending process of autonomy, with two remarks. One is practical and one is theoretical. The practical one has to do with the perception, not with the reality, but the perception of this process. Some of the cases that you have analyzed in your book are quite clear in showing that despite the fact, and here I give completely right to Ambassador Dion, despite the fact that some of these countries have been treated very badly in the past and then have been treated very generously now, it is now that they have the perception of being mistreated, right? Think of Catalonia, which is perhaps the most glaring example of, having been completely oppressed under dictatorship. And now, despite the fact that they enjoy a very, very strong and potentially dynamic autonomy, there has been some circumstance that has completely poisoned the perception. And then the perception, especially on the side of the nationalists, is that, oh my goodness, we are not treated well, and so we need to secede. So practically, it's more about perception than about reality. And the theoretical aspect is what Carl and myself in our book on federalism call the bold man paradox. So, you keep taking individual hair out of the head of someone, and at some point, this person becomes bald. But you cannot define ex ante how many hair one person needs to have to be defined bald or not bald. So it's a matter of quantity you cannot define, but at some point, this well treating and being forthcoming to the claims for autonomy have their end. So probably there must be a point where this might happen. But the thesis is very convincing. And I think it is convincing also for a very practical reason. The alternative to further negotiations is only conflict. There is no alternative. Even if one side perceives something as a problem and the other doesn't simply see the problem, which is the typical dynamic in these territorial conflicts. Normally, a mobilized minority in a territory claims for secession or more autonomy for what matters, and then the predominant view in the central state is well, what do they want? Actually, they have everything they need. We are accommodating, so why bother? Forgetting a very simple, basic principle of human relations, even more basic than institutional relations, which is if somebody has a problem, it doesn't mean if you don't understand the problem that the problem doesn't exist. The problem does exist, even though you do not see it. So in a way, the alternative to this dynamic process of more and more autonomy is simply a conflict. So I don't see a real alternative to that. When it comes to the critical remarks, and some have been already raised by the commentators, I would just mention two very briefly. One is the scope of dynamic autonomy. It seems to me that in your book, as in other literature on that regard, dynamic autonomy is monodirectional. It only looks at the center. So give me more autonomy from the center, and the only relationship is between the territorial entity and the center. But I believe that a balanced way of managing dynamism in autonomy is also a dynamic autonomy inside the territory, which is often neglected, but is something that I think it's worth some consideration. Well, you have been to South Tyrol, just the first example that comes to my mind because it's closer to my day-to-day knowledge. There is always a debate about, the school system, and is that the right one? Separation, no more integration, etc., etc. And nobody looks at the diversity inside the system. So the German-speaking schools in the cities are in a totally different situation as opposed to the German-speaking schools in the valleys, where there are no Italians. So there is no question about, having Italians going to the German schools and watering down the whole system of a minority school. So we should actually also look at dynamic and asymmetric autonomy inside a territory, which is probably something that also deserves a chapter in the new edition of the book. And the final point is about the institutional and the procedural features of this dynamic autonomy. Many have mentioned the Commission of the Six and a few other examples of institutions. But it seems to me that to realize practically your very valid theoretical point that you need to negotiate about dynamic autonomy, there is the need for better suited institutions that are able to deal with that. Because most of the institutions we have are multilateral, which is not good for bilateral relations in that case. What they are missing are the procedures to deal in a legally regulated way with the claims for more autonomy. Otherwise, if the process is too strongly and too much left to the political actors without a strong procedural and institutional framework, the risk is higher that at some point something goes wrong. So maybe also that. And well, if you really intend to consider the next edition of the book, you're welcome to do it at Eurac again. Let me remind you all that you have been awarded the Federal Scholar in Residence Award Program of Eurac, and you're an outstanding example of this program. And I really hope that you can consider it again, and other brilliant scholars will follow your footsteps and also continue to enrich this program. As you see, it has been very productive and successful. So thank you so much. Also, thank you for accepting to share the contents of your book with us, and looking forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you to everybody for being here and for having organized this event. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, André. And just as a concluding note, I just would like to thank all the panelists and all the attendees for being here with us today. And also, I would like to thank the province of Bolzano-Bozen, because this event is part of the project DATE, which I'm currently developing here at Eurac Research. So I hope I will have the same inspiration as you had, André, during my stay, a project that explores the role of equalization mechanism in territorial integration in multi-level systems with secessionist movements. Also, I would like to thank our colleague Petra Malfertaina for helping me to organize this webinar. And finally, I would like to tell you that please stay tuned to our social networks for our upcoming events in the following weeks. So thank you very much for being here with us today, and good evening, good morning to you, André. Thank you very much all for staying with us today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
You're muted, André.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again, Francesco, and everybody. That was really well done, well organized. So I think it worked out really well. So it was
Thank you. Thank you.
Very nice discussion, very nice debate, and very good commentators.
It was a pleasure to have you with us today. It's always a pleasure to see you, even if it's virtually. So
Sure. Let's keep in touch. Your research sounds really interesting, eh?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. One of the cases is Canada, actually.
Of course. We'll have to talk about that, eh?
Yeah. So we'll stay in touch for sure. And I have to write you an email later. So thank you. Thank you very much, André, for this, and also congratulations for the book.
Thanks. Let's keep in touch.
Bye.
Bye.